sure people will come in as we speak. My name is Lisa Herzog. I teach political philosophy at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, and I'm the director of the Center for Politics, Philosophy and Economics here. And I'm also one of the co-organizers. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this panel on bringing democratizing work into the business school curriculum. Business schools have often been seen as the very opposite of the progressive agenda that this forum wants to promote. And the question is, how can their curriculum change from being the high priests of profit-making and shareholder value to something that's more in line with societal values and democracy? So I have the great pleasure of welcoming two speakers here, and hopefully we'll also then have interaction with the audience. And I should also add that Rosier unfortunately had to drop out because of illness. So it's the two speakers and myself and the audience here. Miguel Patro is a senior program manager at the Aspen Institute Business and Society program, where he helps lead a range of programs, including two topics that are particularly relevant for the session today: rethinking the purpose of the corporation, and more recently, an idea lab on worker voice in corporate governance. First 10 years of his career was spent working in business, and he has spent the last 11 years working with scholars, investors, and business leaders to align business decisions with the long-term health of society. Welcome, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Lisa.
And our second panelist is Chris Marquis. Am I saying this correct?
That's fine. That's great.
Okay, sorry. From Cornell University, where he's the Samuel C. Johnson Professor in Sustainable Global Enterprise. Before, he has worked at Harvard Business School and many other business schools worldwide, and he teaches and publishes on many themes, including social innovation and change and doing business in China. Thanks for joining our discussion today.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. Great to be with you.
So first, I want to give both our speakers the opportunity to give us their sense of where we stand today with business schools, and also what you see as the greatest challenges for bringing progressive ideas such as these about democratizing, decommodifying, and decarbonizing work to business schools. Miguel, maybe you can start us off.
Oh gosh, yeah. This is a huge question, Lisa. So it's hard for me to pin down one barrier. That I think what we're really talking about is are systemic barriers. And so by that nature, there are many barriers. I think one way to start this, for me anyway, is to share a story from when I first started at the Aspen Institute. And one of my first projects 11 years ago was to form a faculty network of business faculty who were teaching about frontline and lower wage worker issues. And I thought, great, let's do this. My father worked for the US Department of Labor. My mom was a member of the teachers union. I felt great about this project. And I was quickly frustrated because I could find so few business faculty, and this was very US focused, by the way, very, very few business faculty in the United States at that time who were teaching about anything related to frontline workers. And I got so frustrated at one point, I was asking each faculty member I was able to reach, why am I having so much trouble? What's wrong with me? What am I doing wrong? And they said, there's nothing wrong with you, but just understand that people come to get an MBA so they don't have to manage frontline and low wage workers. And that just told me a lot about what business school is about in the eyes of business students. And where do business students get those perceptions? It's from business schools themselves. And so that raises all kinds of questions for me about the purpose of business school and what role it really is playing in the economy. So I think that's one huge barrier that is important. Over the years, we've worked with a lot of faculty who are trying to drive change in the business academy on a range of issues, whether that's environmental sustainability or more inclusion and issues of inequality. Almost universally, everyone points out that business schools aren't necessarily unique in academia in the inertia that just impedes progress and new ideas. especially from coming in the classroom. There are very few incentives for teaching differently. There are certainly very few career incentives given the tenure system and the ranking systems of business schools. So I'm sure folks on this session are pretty familiar with those. And I'd also just share some research that we did. We interviewed a lot of finance faculty a couple of years ago, specifically to look at how we might evolve how finance is taught in business schools, to broaden how finance is taught, to encapsulate more of the human issues, the environmental issues, and even issues around the rise of technology. How do we think of finance through those lenses? And the inertia was real there as well. So even at the apex discipline of the business academy, faculty members do not feel terribly empowered to do things differently. And one head of a finance department, very prominent finance department, told us kind of off the record that as he looks back over the last 30 years, he is stunned at how little has changed. And the textbooks are largely the same. And if we think of the last 30 years, how much has changed in the real world? How much has changed in capital markets? How much has changed in the economy? That's a stunning admission as well. So I think there's a sense of kind of mindset and kind of what purpose business school is serving, but also the tools that people have to teach remain limited. And so I think those are some big ones.
Thank you very much. Chris, you teach at a business school, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I must say, my sense of Miguel's comments were a little bit of a downer with all these systemic changes. And I think that my comments might even be further along that sort of less positive continuum. I mean, I think that a core issue systemically is that the idea that shareholders are the primary constituency for business is totally infused throughout business schools. I mean, I think that, that many of the ideas that underlie this idea actually came from business schools, like, for instance, short-term stock options and agency theory. That sort of spurred from, Harvard Business School and Michael Jensen, who subsequently has said, "Oh my God, what a big mistake that was." But still, that's what drives actually CEOs' behavior. And I think that sort of a minor quibble with Miguel's points. One of Miguel's points is that he says that finance. So this idea where Jensen is from, where this short-termism and stock alignment happens, is the apex discipline. And I think that actually it is maybe finance people think it's the apex discipline, but within business schools. But actually, if you look at CEOs, these are sort of leaders and managers. And I would say that, the idea that we give so much credence to finance is part of the problem as well. And actually, if you look at departments within business schools, it's not surprising that when, the Aspen Institute interviewed finance people, that they they didn't see much traction of these ideas, because my experience now at 3 business schools is that, sort of finance, accounting, operations to some extent are the faculty, the research are totally bought into shareholder primacy. And this is an ideology. This is not about, this is people believe this is the way the world should be, that companies should, deliver short-term profits first, and have created a bunch of tools around this. And so to actually change that is, I think, really difficult. It's really difficult to change people's mindsets. I do think that sort of in the, management and leadership disciplines, that there is more openness to these ideas. And so I think that, focusing more there is one way. Additionally, regarding the inertia that Miguel describing, if you think about ways of actually changing a field, so to speak, there's like 2 main ways to do it. One is you actually change the people in that field, or you bring in new actors, and over time, the old people die off and the new people sort of grow. And I think that's, I think that trying to change finance people is a dead end. I think it's a waste of time. And I think that, other ways of field level change, I mean, there's new sustainability focused MBAs like at the University of Vermont. There's joint programs, between other schools like at Michigan or Yale. There's increasing work in policy schools on business because students are interested in this. And I think that's another positive lever. Miguel also mentioned that, MBA students don't care about frontline workers because they see themselves as, I don't know, I'm not sure what they see themselves as, but sort of people that are above, managing first line workers. I think, there's ILR, industrial labor relations schools, that also there's a lot of traction. I think also, and I appreciate Miguel prefacing his comments around being very US focused. I think that's also part of the issue. I mean, I think that over time, over the last few decades, that the business school ecosystem has been very US focused. And I do think that actually my sense is over the last 10 years in particular, many European schools are coming to the fore and be much more leading internationally. And I think that's another area where there's possibility. So basically, not to be super pessimistic, but I would say give up on US business schools. They're too entrenched with finance, and all these other mechanisms are the way to actually introduce new ideas to students and new ideas to the world about how to be a responsible and equitable corporate citizen.
Wow, thank you. So we have all the negative things on the table. Let's try to be a bit more positive. What I want to ask you is, do you know of examples of what one would call, from our perspective here, best practices, like new courses being introduced or collaboration with other scholars from other schools outside the narrow business world? And I mean, my impression, I'm an outside observer of this, is that sustainability is sort of making it into business schools. I mean, you have a professorship for that, Chris, I saw.
Right. Yeah.
So if that worked already with sustainability, is there something we can learn for thinking also about other progressive topics to also make it into business schools? Maybe Miguel first again, and then Chris.
Sure. Yes, I mean, there are examples. There are examples of progress. I don't know. I personally don't know of examples of what I would consider best practice if we're thinking of truly but I think there's really substantial progress. And the challenge is, how do we shift from substantial progress being made in individual classrooms to making systemic progress in the business education system and in the ecosystem? We see, we run an awards program every year where we honor innovative teaching in business schools. This past year, and the innovative teaching is always focused around kind of environmental and social sustainability and basically aligning business with the interest and health of society. This past year, we had 160 submissions from around the world of courses that were submitted as where peers or students or deans thought that these represent really innovative teaching. So there's movement there. And we've been doing this awards program for, I think, probably close to 20 years. And this year was pretty striking. I reviewed the final, the courses that made it through to the final round. And there were a couple of just stunning courses that just had a wow factor to them. There was a course out of a school in Canada that was looking at different models of economic thinking based on indigenous philosophies and indigenous ways of looking at the world. So a lot of looking at business through a lens of reciprocity and reconciliation. And they treated reciprocity not only as human reciprocity, but reciprocity with the planet, and reciprocity with the institutions in society and things like that. So I think there are individuals who are just doing remarkable things. But when we talk to those individuals about how they did it, you realize how heroic their effort is. and we need to get to this point where it doesn't require heroism to create a course like this. There was a wonderful course a couple of years ago out of INSEAD that was a leadership course that really reframed leadership in a very useful way and in a very modern way that is real for business leaders as well, by the way. And again, I think it came back to this notion of reciprocity and collaboration, as opposed to hero worship, CEO worship type leadership courses. So there's, I think there are these examples that are kind of beacons in the night, but we need to light up the entire the entire town. We can't just have these little beacons shining individually. So I do see real progress there. I also see demand in the real, from business. I know business schools like to think that they're doing an awesome job serving the needs of business, but when we talk to managers inside business, they don't believe that. And I think this is a real opportunity for business schools and a real opportunity for everyone to leverage. I mean, in this moment of reckonings, or certainly in North America, reckonings around racial injustice and that kind of thing, there's real world need for broader mindsets and the ability to listen. Why isn't that a skill we're teaching with as much rigor as we teach discounted cash flows in a business school? So there are real opportunities here. I think the whole movement around demanding more corporate purpose at work from employees is another interesting opportunity, and companies are working their way through that in a real messy way. But I think all of these trends are waves that we can ride, and we can catch. We just need to be ready to catch those waves.
Thank you. Interesting. Chris, what are your experiences?
Sure. Yeah, I'm also, I appreciate Miguel's positive spin on things, and I concur with some of them, although I think, more generally, my perspective is a little more pessimistic. I think, on the Aspen program, I think that is an example of something that we need more of, and I challenge you guys at Aspen, Miguel, to even go further. I think, I look, as an educator, I'm always excited to see, who is sort of the winner of those. A class that I teach now, it's a little dated, was a finalist in that a number of years ago. And I look at the like you mentioned, this class on indigenous and reciprocity. Wow, it's really amazing innovation. And I think, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, I forget when I was a finalist, my class might have been more cutting edge, but, part of an issue with teaching is that there's also a lot of inertia there too. And, I look at my class and I sort of build it with my passion. But then, you sort of want to, amortize that investment. And so, it's actually, compared to these courses, it's, pretty mundane. But I don't have much incentive to actually change or create a new class. And I think that, the more information we can get out there about these innovative classes, I think the better, because that will help faculty, sort of adopt them, or maybe not even just the courses, but then also, maybe sort of modules or specific classes. Like I could easily probably take a class or two from one of those, innovative courses at one into my class, and then, that's a way to create change. So I've seen some good publicity on these courses, but I hope you can even go further and have, sort of webinars and how-tos and various things by these faculty. So I just want to say, I think that the work Aspen's doing around this is great. To your point though, Lisa, about you seeing positive trend in sustainability, I agree with that, but to me, that is potentially emblematic of the bigger problem around shareholder primacy, because the reason why people focus on sustainability is that, nowadays there's attention and ways that to sort of show that, there's a cost to carbon, both for the company, society, and our future. And so, I think it's very much driven by this idea that it's, quantifiable, and let's actually make a business case for why companies should be sustainable. I think that on other topics, it's much harder to make the business case. Maybe on some HR things, you can say, it's easier to attract and retain people. Totally true, but that's a much, those sort of logical links of that are a lot further along than actually something on sustainability. I think that, I wouldn't take the progress in sustainability as anything super great. I think it's a reflection still of the shareholder primacy that I think is at the core issue. And then finally, core issue that is really impeding business schools being a positive force for change. And then finally, Miguel also, mentioned this idea that business really needs help with these issues and that business schools aren't delivering. I think that's totally on target. I think that, I think part of it relates to this inertia that is in the faculty life. I mean, that sort of there's not a lot of incentive to innovate and create new courses, although lots of examples of people doing that. I know at Cornell I've been talking a lot to folks recently about like executive programs in this area, and I think that we're going to be offering some of those, but it's hard to even do that and to get other faculty involved, and so there is this huge inertia and within the existing system. And just a couple quick things about other institutions. Columbia just recently set up a climate school, so a school that's focused on sort of our climate. I think that sort of interdisciplinary initiatives like that actually have a lot of potential, maybe more so potentially than business schools.
Lisa, can I build on a little bit on what Chris just said, because I totally think he's spot on, especially in terms of calling out the way sustainability is treated currently, and the progress that it's made has been, I think, largely driven by the ability to make some kind of financial shareholder case, and I think that is so spot on, and that is the boundary condition right now in sustainability, I think, and that really limits us. So, and this is true in the corporate world as well, I believe, where we talk in the corporate world, you'll hear a lot of talk around ESG, and ESG, of course, is a term that was invented by investors, and and it's a shorthand to make to kind of so that they can make their models work, and so we look at disclosure, and disclosure is all focused on investor materiality, and I think there's a feedback loop with business schools and in the real world that is extremely challenging, and I completely agree with Chris on the core problem of the ideology. And I would also just say that in a lot of ways, just building on that, what you learn in what the business school curriculum seems to instill, and I don't know if it's intentionally or not, but it seems to instill an ideology of winning. And so embedded, but never really surfaced, is an ideology around power. And in fact, we talk about shareholder primacy. The language of primacy is a power word. Maximize shareholder value, it's power. And so this is a real barrier on the issues of democratizing work. Because, and so I think this is like where we really need to do a lot of substantial work. And part of it is just calling out that in business schools, the ideology is a power ideology, even though it's not said.
I wasn't sure whether I should raise this, but there seems to be something, I'm going to say it, it's a controversial issue, but I think there's a sort of toxic kind of masculinity here, hyper-individualistic. You need to be a winner or you're a loser. You need to do it on your own. Maybe, defend your family, have a wife, children at home, but a very combative attitude where everything is conceptualized as a race or as a fight or some kind of Darwinistic jungle. And at the plenary, at the first day, one of our speakers from Mondragon said something along the lines of, in our business school, we have to have our own business school in the cooperative movement there in Basque Country, because someone who comes from an American business school would never accept something like a maximum difference in wages in a relation of 1:7 or something like that. Do you think that's too disappointing? Is that charging them too much, or do you think that's correct? But if you have a mentality of winning, then of course you're not happy with if you have just 7 times the average salary of employees. So is it this broader cultural undertone or ideology that's also part of the problem here? I mean, you were very much pointing in that direction, Miguel.
Yeah, I'd love to hear what Chris has to say on that first.
Sure.
And
Yeah, I agree. I agree that there is sort of this underlying, I don't know, sort of toxic masculinity. I think that's at least the business schools I'm familiar with. I think that definitely, I can definitely see that. I mean, there is talk at the place I was previously. I won't name it, but some people may know. You know, there was talk of like the A players and the B players. You know, I mean, it's like we at this leading business school, we're about being the A players. And I think that, it's interesting to think about the Mondragon case. And so first of all, I think, very consistent with what I was saying earlier, I did not hear those comments, but, actually starting new business school focused on cooperatives, or having it be maybe sort of more in a policy school or whatever. I do think that it's that the sort of ideology, the deeply entrenched ideology in business schools, particularly in the US, is totally incompatible with these ideas that we're talking about. So I generally supportive that. I would say a couple things. I mean, there are folks in the US that, so that's a broad brush. I mean, I do think that there are pockets of people that really think very deeply about this and ways of engaging them. I mean, one company that I've done some research on is Dr. Bronner's, and they actually have a 5-to-1 ratio. So even, and there's a group in Chile, that focuses on 10-to-1, which I think is more reasonable. It's not 7-to-1, but I think, 10-to-1, I'm totally fine with that. It's interesting if you think about this sort of shareholder primacy movement. I mean, back in 1970, when Milton Friedman sort of wrote his famous article, actually the CEO to average worker pay was only 25-to-1. Nowadays it's, 300, 350-to-1. So, I think that, this, what has happened with, short-termism, stock options, has really driven us off a cliff on this, so to speak. And hopefully we can some way bring it back, but doing it within the current ideology might be hard. One other sort of side point I want to mention on this, and it relates a little bit to this discussion we've been having around sort of the US versus other areas. I a little bit ago, maybe about a year or so ago, I talked to a CEO of a company that it was a merger of a European company and a US company, and the pay rates were totally different. And you had, and the CEO, who was from Europe, is saying to the new American sort of employees, like, why do you need to be paid so much? I mean, this is, sort of, we're trying, in a merged company, you want to have sort of equity across different, the same job function, et cetera. And the CEO told me, he said, one response I got was, it's easy for you to say that, we have multiple kids, I have to pay $75,000 a year for their education. If they're in college, there's a variety of healthcare expenses, various people in my family have to pay, retirement, is an issue. And so I think that it's, not to defend this outrageous pay, because it's disgusting in many ways, but it is part of a larger system issue where the US is really focused, I think, very much on sort of much more sort of free market individualism, and there's corollaries of it that actually end up reinforcing it.
Thank you.
there's 2 years ago, I guess it was, maybe last year, I forget. The time is all so compressed in the COVID era. We did some research on executive compensation, and what we wanted to do is come up with new principles to help guide boards in a realistic way. So that, I mean, the principles are fairly moderate, but the second principle we articulate is a principle around fairness within the firm and defining fairness within the firm. And that principle has gotten a lot of attention from people who will like email us and be like, I like these principles, but what are you getting at here? You know, what are you really saying? And by the way, what's fair? How do we even know what's fair? And we've had pushback from scholars. We've had pushback from some corporate directors who object to that word, the idea, as well. And so that, to me, that's pretty telling as well of how much work we need to do. It's people are really fearful in America, in the United States, about imposing a definition of fairness, and I think that hinders our ability to address equity and the problems that are kind of bigger societal problems. And so I just wanted to mention that as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Let me add something on. I mean, this. You mentioned directors, and I had the chance recently to interview Emmanuel Faber, who was CEO of Danone. Not U.S. but headquartered in Paris, and he talked to me about the difficulty that he had on actually giving up his executive pension and taking a regular Danone pension, and he wanted to take the $25 million that was on the books and actually distribute it to employees, so so all employees would have a stake. And he describes, and I published this interview is published in Forbes, that actually there was so much resistance to this among the executive directors because people see it as a challenge because they're CEOs at places, and will there be pressure on them to do this? There are these various consultancies that sort of benchmark employee, CEO pay, and that's actually how compensation committees on boards end up setting it. And so him, by doing this, was so counter-normative that it would sort of upset this system that everyone is brought into. And I must say, this idea of CEO pay, so many companies are willing to talk about stakeholder capitalism, but CEO pay is rarely brought up or on the table. I mean, it's really, a big issue that I think we've been talking about it for decades now, unfortunately. So I'm not sure it's going to change in the near future, but it is, in many ways, a disgusting thing that occurs in U.S. companies.
Could I now start bringing in some questions from the audience?
Sure.
Is that okay?
Great.
And I think, given that we're not a huge panel, we can probably also invite those who would like to do this to join with video and audio and ask their questions or give their comments in person. Maybe you can indicate in the chat if you would like to do this. And meanwhile, I'll start taking some of the questions from the Q&A box. And one of the first persons who asked the question was Noé Amante from the Philippines, who says he teaches employment relations, and he definitely, you are here, so I can add you and you can speak for yourself. That's much better. Let's see if that works. Yes, you're here. Can you hear us?
Yes, I could hear, but seems I could not open my video.
Doesn't matter. We hear you very well.
Thank you, but this is most relevant for us for handling business or employment courses. And what do we do now? So this is a great chance for us. And what do we do now? That's my essential question. I was thinking that maybe there should be some common out of this global forum. We could have some concrete outcomes along the lines that you have discussed or proposed. That's all.
Thank you very much.
I mean, a textbook or a book project or something like that. That could be collaborative. A lot of our multinational enterprises are either from Europe or from the United States. A few from, and there is a big contrast with the business enterprises coming in. from China. So we used to have a lot of Korean and Japanese enterprises, but the way we teach or handle the way of management seems to have faded into the background, and now we have a new context, a new background, which is demanding. There is definitely demand for new ways of teaching and thinking, because the way we have been teaching, we have to admit, is to destroy the planet. I mean, that's what the implications of what I have heard so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who wants to take this first?
I could say a couple. So I think that, I mean, the idea of, I mean, you mentioned textbooks. I think curricula in general, I think is hugely important. I think, you know, the work that Aspen and Miguel is doing and some of the comments that he mentioned, I think are really insightful on that. One, I do think that maybe within like sort of finance or business schools, it's a challenge because those institutions are not set up, you know, the US I'm mainly talking about, to sort of focus on more labor relations issues. You know, there's not HR departments, for instance, in most business schools. There's management and leadership departments. And so I think that, you know, but creating more curriculum around that, I think could be helpful because it could then get sort of infused into some of these classes. And I would say, you know, things like labor relations schools, you know, I look at Cornell where I teach now, you know, it's the ILR school there, which is well known, where a lot of the innovations in these issues are being done. Public policy schools I've mentioned before. So I concur 100% with your point about creating new materials, but I'm not sure if the business school is the right place to get those.
I'd build on that, Chris, too, and just say that I think in speaking to a lot of scholars who want to teach differently, one point of paralysis is that they don't feel qualified to teach on broader issues than that kind of start to bleed outside of their domain. And so I think there's a real need to do more collaborative teaching, get out of our disciplines and identify partners who, I mean, on campus, there's so many great resources on campus. And Chris, you mentioned some programs that do some of this kind of cross-disciplinary stuff. I know in the MBA curriculum, time constraints weigh heavily on faculty as well. So people have pointed to undergraduate business education as maybe a really useful laboratory for collaborative teaching and a way to build a more solid foundation around curricula. Because you have 4 years instead of 2, and you know the ranking tyranny and all that stuff isn't as nasty. So I think there are some opportunities there, but I think definitely collaborative teaching across disciplines is really necessary. And in some ways, we have to be very mindful that faculty who have built their career in the current business school system themselves have not been trained on a lot of these issues, and they do feel uncomfortable kind of stepping out of that comfort zone. So we need to address that in a practical way.
Thank you. I'd now like to give the word to David Jacobs. You're still muted, but you can unmute yourself. He can't hear you. Yeah, now you should.
I'm unmuted. Thank you. I think we're beginning to see the answer emerging from these possibly negative sounding remarks. And that is, I believe that we have to think in distributed terms. That is to say, what is required institutionally is to build networks across departments and to find pockets that sustain one another. Now, I'm sorry, there's some dogs in the background. In my current institution, there are a variety of students taking business ethics. They come in from other schools. So some of them are already more receptive to progressive ideas about workers because of that context. Also, there has been a joint master's program with international development and business, which became a great opportunity for me to talk to students who wanted to become advocates of global justice because they were in this context of multiple programs. And I noticed at a place like Georgetown, It's not the business school that is having so much innovation on worker issues, but there's an institute called the Kalmanovitz Institute, in which there's a network of faculty who address worker issues, which then filter into the business school. So I think we have to do things deliberately in a distributed way, recognizing that we're not going to get the anchors in the business school to change the curriculum, but we may be able to coordinate a larger movement. And then finally, what helps this is if there's some activism on campus that helps students get interested in these issues. That happened at Georgetown, certainly over sweatshop issues, that had impact upon a whole variety of things that happened in Georgetown. And now where I'm teaching in America, there are 4 unions that are active, and students are beginning to address those issues in their out of class activities. So there's some hope if we can coordinate the disparate centers of activism outside the rigid business school context. Forgive me for the ambient noise.
Thank you. Do you want to react to that, Chris or Miguel?
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think that's a fantastic point. I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, most of my points were relatively pessimistic and said, basically forget about business schools and focus. But I think that sort of Miguel's point about actually undergrads being a really interesting population, and then this point of David of trying to think about, sort of interdisciplinary ways to do it are really thoughtful and smart ideas. I mean, I think at Cornell, I mean, my experience has been that's actually where a lot of the innovation happens. I mean, it's not on labor. More of my work is on sustainability, so I'm more familiar with that. But there's a university-wide sustainability center that, one of David's written comments talks about getting corporate support, where, there was an endowment created, and, it's connecting people in the ILR school with business school with actually climate scientists, and it's very fruitful. And this is where the platform through which we're going to be doing this executive education program that I mentioned. And I think that on all these topics that we're talking about, there are, these cross-disciplinary opportunities, and there just needs, I think, both faculty passion and leadership to help create those, but then also I think it's useful to get some funding as well. So I think that, trying to do things, I think there's a lot of potential in this interdisciplinary. So I just want to echo what David said.
Thank you. Miguel, any extra points, or should I ask more people?
Let's get another question in. I think Chris, I would just ditto David and Chris. So.
Well, there are at least 3 more people who have asked questions in the Q&A. Let me ask once more whether they would like to join us in person. So I see Stefan Deschantre, Maria Daskalaki, and Fred Freundlich. If you would like to join us directly, then please click on the Add Video and Audio button, and then you can comment or question yourself. Yeah, we have Fred here now, so maybe he can go next. Hey, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't. I teach here at the business school in Mondragon, actually. And it's I don't know if I have a question. I have ruminations that I couldn't help but put in the Q&A and see what might lead. I mean, why do people? The latest thing on my mind is, why do people go to top 10, top 20 business schools? Would a course, a program be of interest? Would it have any effect? I wonder. I mean, there probably are interesting courses at top 10, top 20, top 50 business schools. Do we know if they have any effect on people, on students?
Like, you mean that's a self-selection of people?
I mean, are the people who apply to these business schools and end up going to these business schools, I don't know how much interest they have in sort of progressive social change, sustainable business, promoting democratic businesses, and et cetera. And I just wonder if courses at these places have ever been studied, if they've ever had any effect on their students.
So we, years ago now, this is very dated, and it was survey research, so take it for what it's worth. But years ago, we did a survey of incoming over several years, incoming business students, their attitudes coming into business school and their attitudes coming out of business school. And over the course of years, we were able to kind of pull out a few insights. And one of them was that a lot of business students are going to business school with pretty high aspirations and high expectations about what business can be about and business as a force for change and good. They leave business school, well, let's just say more disciplined than that or something. Like they've been indoctrinated in a different way when they leave. Now, I think there are lots of people that are going into traditional business schools who do have high aspirations for business. And I think what we're losing this huge potential right off the bat. When they engage in their first finance or accounting courses, there was an acquaintance of mine who started her MBA last year, and her first finance course, day one, the first lecture was the professor basically disavowing any notion of stakeholder capitalism and making the case that shareholder primacy was the way things were going to be in that class. And he basically wanted to close that conversation off for the rest of the semester. That's day one. In accounting, this is the same person. She went to her first accounting class and was told that accounting is the language of business, and this is how you're going to tell your story to your investors. And with a wink and a nod, now the story you're going to tell your investors about your profitability is not what you want to tell lead with in a labor negotiation when you're talking about wages. So these are day one type messages that are being infused right off the bat. And so I think we're just, we're kind of destroying a lot of potential with some of the ideological stuff that Chris has raised right off the bat. And it's silly. There's no need, like the tools of finance are useful if you look at it, if you pursue a different purpose than shareholder wealth maximization. Those tools are still useful. So the only thing that the ideology really cements is the finance department's primacy in the school. And so I think those are the kinds of things we need to break down. But I think there's a lot of potential going into business schools and great talent coming out. But we're not exposing them to enough of the breadth of ideas that are going to make the difference between them being a great analyst coming out of business school for their first job out of business school versus being a great leader or a great manager, 5 or 7 or 10 years down the line.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and I'm really sad to hear those stories of the first day accounting and finance classes even worse than I had worried it would be. I mean, this is part of the reason why. I mean, my frustration with business schools. I've spent some time in a public policy school, and I'm actually moving to a UK business school as of January. Not the main reason why I'm moving, but partially reason sort of frustration with this sort of U.S. overly focus on shareholder primacy. This is why I think that it's really a worthless activity to try to convert these institutions, because I think the ideology is too entrenched. I think to Fred's comment about and to build a little bit on Miguel's comment about the top 10 business schools and whether the people that go there are, what do they want? I mean, is it just to make, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars as an investment banker or high-level consultant? My experience is similar to Miguel's, actually. So when I was at Harvard Business School, we did a sort of reflective essay with the students on the first day. And it was interesting. So I taught in the first term there, and I would actually revisit those at the end of the first term with the students. And it's amazing how, so I would say 20-30% of the students would come in wanting to actually change the world, basically, in positive ways. And by the end of the first term, even, that had been so beaten out of them. I think probably the ideas that Miguel, or the sort of examples Miguel had presented, but also the recruiting system at these institutions is so driven by, okay, we will, you'll get a high salary if you go to an investment bank or consulting company, and our rankings are partially determined by the salaries. And it's easy. We have all these connections. So we're sure, if you want to go work in some, NGO focused on climate change, how do we, the recruiting people, how do we even actually make those connections? We don't have any alumni. So I think the system is really just so set up to, sort of reinforce these issues. So I think it's more the system in the schools, consistent with Miguel saying, than necessarily the people that are going into that. Although a lot of the people that are going into it, basically just to make more money. But there's a huge percentage that aren't. Go ahead. Sorry.
Can I just briefly interject the question that Maria Descalaki asked here? I mean, what do you think about just shutting them down? I mean, it's probably not realistic, but it sounds like you're not too
totally.
far.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's like it is for changing the world for good. To try to change business schools is I think worthless endeavor. You're just going to waste your time. So find other ways. Maybe I do think actually the undergrads have a little bit more potential, like Miguel was saying. I think David was saying, maybe there's some interdisciplinary focus. A lot of the examples I gave, ILR schools, policy schools, new MBA programs that are focused on sustainability. I think those are where we, maybe non-US business schools. I mean, I think those are where there's actually traction can be had over the long run. I am not optimistic about changing finance people or accounting people.
Okay.
Can I? Oh, I see Maria's coming on. I'd love to react to what Chris said. Should I do that?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay.
Yes. Oh, hi there. Hi. Yeah, basically it's just touching upon previous comments we had in terms of, interdisciplinarity and moving into actually outside the business school to find critical aspects in our teaching and in our perspectives on business issues. So, my idea is exactly that I'm kind of given up to the business school, although I'm working in a business school myself, actually in the UK. I'm a professor at Southampton Business School in the UK. But I'm thinking increasingly, what recently Martin Parkin has suggested, that moving away from the business school to the School of Organizing, which is in favor of alternative forms of organizing, about democratizing work, cooperative forms of work, and of course, looking at ethics and sustainability as the values and the basis for these types of organizing. So yes, I'm very much interested in hearing, views and ways of shutting down the business school, actually, and then proposing an alternative that actually trying to fix the business school, because I think that probably it's something that is beyond being fixed. So yes, thank you.
So Maria, that's a really interesting point, and I think you raise a very provocative question. And I'm going to argue that we cannot give up on business schools. So at least here in the United States, the MBA is it accounts for something like a quarter of all graduate degrees in the entire country. So it is a massive system, like hundreds of thousands of students are going through this system, and each year. And it is becoming one of the key kind of education systems for leadership in our society. And so we can't abandon it. We can't leave it to the voices that control it now. I think we do need to find creative ways to get more pressure on business schools, whereas business schools seem to be very insulated, in part because they're business schools, not business departments, and so they have lots of funding, and in some cases, the dean of the business school is just as powerful as the provost of the university, and so we need to find ways to apply pressure on business schools to change. But I would really worry about giving up on business schools because this is where a lot of future leaders in society are being educated with their graduate degrees, and these ideas are not going away, and we can't censor them away. We need to counter them. And I'll just note that in the United States, in the 21st century, every Republican nominee for a presidential election, with the exception of John McCain, has been educated in a business school. George Bush was our first president with an MBA, and since then it was only John McCain who did not go to business school. He was imprisoned in Vietnam, while Donald Trump was dealing with his bone spurs. But this is the reality, and so we cannot get leadership in our society around these issues that's educated and sensitive to these issues by giving up on business schools. I think we still have to do this hard work. We have to keep finding ways to apply pressure, get tools in the hands of people so that they can respond to the pressure well, and offer some pathways for change. It's hard. I'm not gonna sit here and say it's easy, but I think we have to fight the fight.
Thank you. Let's take Stefan now. We've let you wait for a long time. Stefan, can you unmute yourself? Now you seem to be unmuted. Can you try to speak?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, great.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Lisa, for letting me join the conversation, and I'm sorry because I can't share my video. But many thanks for the discussion. And my point was that as a professor of management control in a French business school, I can see some hopes, I would say that, coming even from mainstream theories, in my field, I teach the balance scorecard, which stands for the stakeholder theory, or even in the AACSB accreditations, we need to show that we raise critical thinking to the students. So I think in every domain there is some critical aspects, some limits, some perverse effects that are identified by the academics, and I think these are elements on which we could build on which we could build to bring some aspects on decommodifying or even democratize work. So I would like to hear you reflect or react on that point. Thank you very much.
Can I ask you, thank you, to also maybe combine your answer with a question from Björn that's in the chat, who says that one of the issues is that business schools tend to focus primarily on large corporates and how to thrive in these systems, whereas the majority of businesses are smaller, and that's where the actual innovation happens. And because we're almost at the end of our session, I would also see this as the opportunity for the last statements from the two of you. So any final words you want to share with us? Who wants to go first? Chris.
Sure, I'll say something great. So, I mean, I really appreciate the comments. I do think, as I've mentioned, that perhaps European business schools, there's more creative things going on around sort of labor and sustainability and different economic models. And I think that, the extent to which that can be brought into the different accrediting bodies, which then will spill over to the US, I think is a potential mechanism for change. And I agree sort of with Bjorn's comment. I mean, large business schools are frequently focused on larger companies. Again, I mean, part of it is this reinforcement of wanting to place students in jobs that have higher pay, that then, sort of, move the rankings higher. And I think that's something, I'm not sure how exactly to change it, but I think it's something that's important. So thank you.
So I think looking at Bjorn's comment, one thought comes to mind, and in a lot of the writing that's coming out of like the consulting world around leadership, the types of firms that place CEOs or place boards, there's an interesting acknowledgement now that big business is so complex, big global business is so complex, it can't possibly be run from the top down anymore. That a corporate board that meets in a headquarters, or a CEO that sits there, can't possibly truly understand their business anymore. It's just between technology, globalization, financialization, the speed of change, social pressures, just way too complex. And I think that's a huge opportunity for democratizing work. That is the argument for getting more voices into the management system, into the leadership system, and getting more voices into our decision-making processes. Workers are antenna. They should be, we can think of workers as sources of information the way finance people think of capital markets as sources of information. And this is a huge opportunity. So I think big corporates, there's a way to argue this. And I think this is not to dismiss small and medium-sized enterprises, but I'm just struck recently at how much I see this reality, and where leaders are starting to kind of confess that they need more collaborative leadership. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to say, hey, we've got a solution for that. Bring your workers, give your workers some kind of seat at the table. Listen to your workers. Start with DEI, start with diversity or health and safety out of the pandemic, something that's an immediate need, and build from there. And maybe we can start viewing workers as real assets to the assets to the firm that they are, but just need to be recognized as.
Thank you. That's actually also something that happens in the philosophical debate about workplace democracy, bringing the epistemic, as we call it, aspects, and like who knows the things that a company needs to know. So we could continue for a long time here, but we are at the end of our session. Let me just tell everyone that in the Q&A box, there are actually a couple of other interesting comments. So read them, and you can engage with each other through the direct messaging function. But first, let me thank our two panelists so much. This was super interesting, sort of depressing, but also sort of hopeful. And also thank you to all the people who participated in live or in the chat. Thank you so much. Definitely something to work on. And we'll keep in mind these ideas about having to think about more collaboration around alternative texts, alternative courses. Hopefully this will be continued. Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks,
Thank
Lisa.
you, Miguel. Yeah. Bye-bye.